Hello, it's John Logan. I'm back for another philosophy video. I finally came up with a name for the channel. I'm hopefully going to change my name to that. I'm going to call it Bonadventure Time. That does not come from me, and I know it's probably a little cliche or whatever it is, but that's what I'm going to start calling this, is Bonadventure Time. Saint Bonaventure is one of my patrons I've adopted, and I think I just love how poetic he is. It certainly led me to appreciate other poetical philosophers and to see the beauty in their writing, but also just beauty itself. So Bonaventure, welcome to Bonaventure Time. And I finally am making due on my promise. I know I made a Kant video on his kind of his epistemology, or at least very basic epistemology, and I plan to continue that and do his analytic of the sublime and kind of his four moments of the judgment of taste and beauty. But today, I'm the medievals. I can't miss them. So I'm going to make a medieval video. I'm going to make it on St. Augustine. And St. Augustine, I am not going to do an introduction or really a biography of him, because that guy, I would take forever. I mean, that would just take super long. So I'll just hit some quick bullet points for him. Wrote prolifically, wrote some of his famous works, Confessions, that is an autobiography, one of the first of its kind, actually. That's a great read. Deep philosophy, but also very accessible. Very unique, and again, one of a kind. The first of its kind, really. So that's a very famous work from him. Yeah, it's a famous quote in there, or a famous passage related by loved you, and a famous quote, "Our hearts are restless, Lord, until they rest in thee." And then another famous work would be on the Trinity. That is a very dense book on the Trinity, as it says. Basically, at the end, he concludes that he's learned nothing on the Trinity. And maybe I'll make a video on the Trinity, or at least a little introduction to it, and share a story about how he was preparing to write it. There's a neat story to that. And then he has just a lot of other, City of Gods, another great one that looks into a little bit of the ethics, but also some other philosophical ideas. And then he just writes a lot. I think he has more books written than like a lot of the church fathers combined, and Thomas Aquinas included with that. So he wrote a ton. I guess a quick recap of his life. Was young, was very intellectual, sought truth. That was his big thing. That's how he found God, was truth, and I'll come into that with the video on what we're going to talk about. So truth was a big deal for him. He was very attracted to the Platonic idea, so that was with Plato. If you don't know anything about Plato, he thought in forms and dualism. So body, soul are different, or not different. The soul is entrapped in the body, is kind of what Plato thought. That's a very quick introduction to the Platonic idea. There's more, but I won't. If you want to know a little bit about Plato's, a little bit of his aesthetics, I made a video on that on the Symposium, which is a beautiful defense of love. So if you want to see that, I can add a link to that. So yeah, Augustine was very much attracted to the Platonic, and then fell away from any sort of religious idea and went into the Manichaeans, which is a heretical group, basically. And actually, Augustine, when he would convert, would later just beat up on the Manichaeans and would kind of dissipate that. So I guess it turned out for Augustine, not so much for the Manichaeans. But then truth was really what led him. He was constantly seeking truth, and you see this if you ever read the Confessions. I highly recommend it. That he's having these moments where he continually reflects on what truly makes one happy. And in spiritual sobriety, I don't know if you've ever heard of that, or a term of that kind of term, but it's something that you would find in the Confessions, where he has this moment where he encounters a drunk man, and he says when he wakes up, he will no longer be drunk. But and he's not referring to alcohol, says, I will still be drunk. And he's talking about like this drunkenness of not feeling. Like he's become numb to feeling. And it's a very beautiful reflection. So he starts reflecting on, actually it's one of the first of its kind to kind of turn towards the subject, to kind of turn to objectivity, to kind of, to see the experiencing and turning towards the subject. So very beautiful reflections, and that's kind of how he kept searching for truth, in line with happiness, and eventually he found it, and he heard the Lord say to him, "Tole et lege," which is take up and read. And he did that, and he read a very powerful passage from Scripture, and then he would give his life to Christ, and it's a very beautiful story. His mom was also Saint Monica, prayed fervorously for him unceasingly, and showed great motherly love. And Augustine just was brilliant, again incorporated the Platonic idea into the Catholic tradition of philosophy, and for a long time Catholic philosophy would have been associated with the Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophy until Thomas Aquinas would introduce the Aristotelian methodology. So that's kind of a little bit of an introduction to Augustine. There's far more that could be said, and I have not done him justice in this biography. Honestly, I think the only true way to give him true justice is to read his Confessions. Very beautiful and a very easy read, so I highly recommend it. And with that, though, we're going to talk about one of his works on free choice of the will. And in this is a beautiful dialogue. He gives, what we're going to focus on today is his proof for God's existence. And this is a very, it might seem odd at first, but it's actually a very beautiful proof for God's existence. It's if you're familiar with Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs, this one's more reflective and it's more of an internal argument. So it has a beautiful, you could say, relationship with the Lord that is established in this proof. So with this proof, he's going to start with distinguishing, being, and he's going to acknowledge that there are some beings that just are. So he could say, like, analogously, like a rock. A rock just is, and it doesn't do anything. Or, the grass just is and doesn't do anything. I guess it grows, so that was a bad example. The rock, going back to the rock just is and it doesn't do anything. But something like vegetation or sentient beings, right, they don't just exist, but they actually move in the world. They have sentience. They live. And so that's a very real thing. And so there's how he makes that hierarchy he's building. And I should mention that that's a very Platonic way to argue. Platonics love transcendence. For them, they had their own Platonic heaven, and it's all about transcending the natural world, the visible world, to the realm, the intellectual realm, or the realm of forms, as Plato would call it in his divided line analogy. So this is very much, the way you'll see this argument is very much a Platonic argument in the way he's transcending and kind of going up a ladder, so to speak. So back to that, he's identified beings that are, beings that live, and now higher than that would be beings that exist, that live, and are rational. And this would be us, right? As humans, we can actually reason and understand things that are happening in the world. We don't just encounter objects, we encounter, subjects as well, that would distinguish us as well, but other objects and understand meaning, right? And animals can't do that. They can't ponder or reflect on causation, right? And so as rational beings, right, this would distinguish us, and that's a certain dignity, right, that is placed in man. And so he's made that distinguishing. He's building this ladder, and now he's going to focus a little bit on man. He'll kind of come back to that hierarchy of being, but he kind of puts it to the side and goes now into assessing the human being. And in his assessment, he starts with the 5 senses. And this is a very interesting and actually kind of a neat analysis he makes. In his assessment of the human person, he makes the assessment of the 5 senses, and he starts to make a hierarchy of the senses. And for him, taste and smell are going to be the lowest of the senses. And the reason why he would posit that is because when you taste or when you smell, you absorb the object in, and in a way he would describe it as sort of destroying the object, right? When you eat a food, that food is gone, right? You don't just say, oh, that's a chicken. You can have another piece of chicken, but if there's only one chicken, that chicken's gone, right? So you absorb the object, and in some sense it becomes destroyed, right? And so they're also very subjective, right? Because you have taste is super subjective, right? You could love cupcakes and your friend could not. You could love bacon and your friend who is a heretic does not. I'm just kidding. But you should love bacon. But not everyone does, right? It's a very subjective sense as well as smell, right? These are very subjective. Which all the senses in some sense are subjective. But these are the most subjective of the senses. And so he puts those at the lowest, and now he's going to place in between the top 2 senses. So the next sense that he would say is higher than those, but still not the highest, would be touch. And touch is higher because it's not as subjective, and you can't, right, when you're eating something, you don't eat something, when you don't share what you eat, right? In a sense, you're thinking, well, yeah, you have the same meal, but you don't, like, the part of the chicken that you eat, that other person cannot eat, right? And so, the smell, while you can share certain smells, again, it's more subjective. And with touch, though, Augustine's going to note you can actually touch the same thing, right? Like the rock, you can touch the same spot. But the reason this is not going to be the highest sense, he's going to note that you can't touch the same spot of the rock at the same time, right? You would have to move the other person's hand, and then you could touch that part. So it's not quite as simultaneous. You can't, not at all actually, you can't touch it simultaneously at the same time, the same part of the rock, but nonetheless you could touch the same part of the rock. And so that's why touch is going to be higher than that taste and smell for him, but then it's not the highest. And he's also making this analysis in the senses that you don't taste that you're tasting, you don't smell that you're smelling, and you're not touching, you don't perceive that you're touching, you don't touch that you're touching, right? That sounds ridiculous. And so that's why he's positing there's got to be something higher, and he keeps building up. And so there's something higher than touch itself, and that would be the two senses of sight and hearing. And these are higher than touch because you can simultaneously see the same thing, right? Two people can simultaneously see the golf course in front of them, right? So they can simultaneously do that, and as well as hearing, right? And so they're the least subjective, and you can simultaneously do both of them at the same time. So he's going to posit that these are the highest of the senses, and in a way, they kind of are the most powerful, right? Because sight really dictates a lot of the senses, because in the sense you see what you're tasting, right? You see what you're smelling, right? You see what you're touching, right? And so it's very one of the more primordial senses, you could say, and Augustine would posit that, although you could make certain counter arguments, but we won't go into that. And so, but again, he's going to note with these senses, right? You can't see that you're seeing, and you can't hear that you're hearing. So something has to be above it. They don't perceive themselves. And so he says there has to be something above these even as well. And what he would posit is this would be called the inner sense, is how he refers to it. Some scholars have speculated he means instinct by this. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to keep referring to it as the inner sense. And for this, he says the inner sense directs all the other five senses. Right, so it helps with ordering all these senses, you could say. But he's going to again remark that the inner sense does not perceive itself. So something has to direct even this inner sense. And he's going to posit that this is going to be reason. And reason dictates the senses, right? And furthermore, reason perceives itself. You can reason that you're reasoning, right? I think that I'm thinking. I think, therefore I am. No, I'm just kidding. We're not Cartesian. Right, so you can reason that you're reasoning. So this directs the senses, therefore reason, and this is bigger, this is the best. So this is the top, and again we go back to that hierarchy of being. This is why rationality sets us apart from everything, right? So we're coming back to that hierarchy, and he's establishing as man, and so reason is this highest one. So now he's going to say if there's something higher than man, and if we're at the top of the hierarchy in the world, then he's kind of, begging the question, like, then, right, wouldn't you admit that some higher entity, like such as God, could exist if there is something higher than us, if we're at the top of the hierarchy of being, right? Because he's going to say something needs to dictate reason, and what he's going to posit is truth, right? Because truth orders reason. It's very beautiful. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, talks about how reason is like the greatest of man's faculties, right? Man's ability is to reason, right? Because he reasons to reality, and reality brings us the good, and the good makes us happy. And so for Aristotle, happiness is in accord with right reason. But that's, sorry, I'm going into Aristotelian. But reason is dictated by the truth, right? The truth, and that's kind of why I mentioned Aristotle. Like, it's truth, it's that reality that is presented to us through reason, and it's what governs reason, right? And so Augustine finds this here, right? And truth governs reason. And when you are irrational, when you're acting unreasonable, it is truth that sets you back on the line, that makes you act within reason, right? And that can be for the ethics, like Aristotle, or that could be for anything, the Catholic life, right? If you, the moral life, the Christian moral life, right? So truth sets us back to reason, right? It allows us to reason well, and or you could say right, as Aristotle would posit. So in identifying that truth is higher than reason, right? That necessarily means that there is something that exists that is higher than man, right? And furthermore, that orders all of man. And he's going to say truth is immutable, right? It's unchangeable and it's eternal, right? And he's going to quote then John 14:6, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? And so now he's identified truth with God as this immutable and unchanging and eternal being, right? And there he has made the hierarchy from being, including the senses, and has elevated now into posit that there is a God, he is truth, and he orders all things. So it's a very beautiful argument, right? And why I said at the beginning this is more internal than Thomas Aquinas is because, right, he starts with the subject. Again, it's a very neat thing that Augustine does, is that he starts usually with the subject. You see similar themes in the Confessions, and this is how he comes to truth. He starts and then he does that transcendence, right? It's very Platonic, or Neoplatonic to be more accurate, but certainly Platonic in its own right. And it's a very beautiful argument because it establishes, right, it establishes a relationship between God and man. It shows that God is accessible to man, right, through right reason. And it actually is very similar in many ways to Thomas Aquinas, right? Because there is a part in Book 2 of On Free Choice of the Will where Augustine perceives the idea of unmoved moving. That is a concept that was founded a long time ago. It's in Plato's Dialogues in the Phaedrus, I believe. I believe it's the Phaedrus. Plato's identifies this principle of unmoved moving. Aristotle finds it in his Physics. And then, of course, Aquinas perfects it in his 5 proofs for God's existence in the beginning of Prima Pars. So he kind of, you see some relations to that and perhaps how that idea would develop and be perfected by Aquinas. But also seeing truth as ordering everything, you can kind of see like the hints at the cosmological argument that Aquinas would use. That's one of the 5 proofs he would use. So you certainly see there's a lot of credibility you can give to Augustine. But then also, I want to stress this. I firmly believe this with the proofs of God's existence, is that these are not just apologetic tools, right? We don't just use these, learn them, and be like, okay, let me memorize this, and let me perfect this way of thought, and then I'll go tell it to someone and prove to them that God exists. Like, it's in accord with the right reason, and Aristotle says that's going to make us happy and all that, right? No, I mean, certainly these are very good, and it's been great that these fearsome servants of the Lord have given us these beautiful reflections and proofs for God's existence, right? It's what theology is, faith-seeking understanding, and now they've used their philosophy to show that it is reasonable to say that a God exists, even though in faith, right, we should believe that. But right, and so these aren't just apologetic tools, though. I think more so we should recognize that these arguments, these proofs, are just as much for us as they are for those who don't even believe in God's existence. And I don't mean that to say, like, oh, they validate, like, oh, I can believe God exists now because it's rational, because it's reasonable, right? No, that's a total degrading of the true heart of philosophy. What I mean by that is, I think these are beautiful reflections to see how God, right, to reflect and meditate on God ordering the universe as truth, to reflect and meditate on God as truth, to reflect and meditate even on the human person, as Augustine does, right, on the 5 senses, the inner sense, reason, right, and see how beautiful that is, but also to see, right, the ordering of that, especially in truth. And so I think we could see this in all the arguments, right? Anselm's ontological argument, highly critiqued, highly loved by some, very odd argument, I will give it that. But also, I mean, he wrote it mostly as a reflection. And so you see, like, these are a lot of these are reflections and good meditation, even for those, even if, right, in faith we believe God exists, and that's it does take that faith to profess God in an explicit faith. But now I'm kind of divulging from our topic. But yeah, I did want to stress that. I think that's the beauty of this proof for God's existence. It's very poetic, it's very Platonic, and it gives good thought into the human person, but also good meditation for God as truth itself. So I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like it. If you're liking these videos, please subscribe to Bonaventure Time, and I'll hopefully make more. I'm hoping to make a Thomas Aquinas one and a St. Bonaventure one soon. So, peace.